So welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your busy day to spend a little bit of time with us in contemplation and consideration of the history of Sufism as we're looking at it today. Just to reiterate for those of you who may be joining us for the first time or just coming back after a long week, um, the initial period which we have covered so far was some of the general themes of Sufism, and then we looked in particular at the early period through Hassan of Basra and Rabia as well. And in looking at these early figures, we looked at some of the typologies of what constituted early Sufism. And what we find in particular at this early stage is that we're going to encounter people who are mystics deep in dread or deep in fear of God. And we are looking at mystics as those who wail, those who can't function in normal life because of this deep connection that they're feeling to the divine. And of course, anytime you've got an instance like that taking place, it's going to chafe people who are otherwise law abiding because Muhammad himself understands his religion to be the people of the middle way. And the middle way implies that we reject the extremes of monasticism and self starvation and flagellation, and alternatively, we reject the Dionysian approach of drunkenness. And so, between these two extremes is ideally what maybe Muhammad means by the middle path. Sufism, of course, in many cases involves a rejection of that. And this will be illustrated today in some of the stories I'll be sharing with you and some of the ways we're going to be looking at this next phase of Sufism. So, just to keep us on task, and for those of us who are reading along, for today's class, we were looking in particular at chapter 2 from Karl Ernst's Sufism, An Introduction to the Mystical Tradition of Islam. And in terms of the material covered in there, today we're going to be dealing with some of the sacred sources of Sufism. Now, we have to begin with a bit of a caveat, right? So, one of the issues that we're going to encounter is when we are looking at Sufism, sometimes they are going to use hadith, the word, the term that we use to refer to the declarations of Muhammad, and also what we can draw from those hadith in terms of his lived life experience, the so called sunnah, which is where we get the word Sunni from. So, when we're dealing with this period, we're also going to be talking a little bit about how Sufis interpret the Quran. And the interpretation of the Sufi approach to the Quran is going to be quite different than maybe most mainstream Muslims. And the one of the reasons for this difference is they're going to tend to rely on mystical interpretations of the text as opposed to the on face meaning. These are often described in Arabic as the term zahir and baitini, the idea of the hidden versus zahir is the clear, the readily apparent, and the baitini meanings are the hidden or secret meanings, which may be accessible well, at least the Sufis would argue that it's accessible to them. So, in this tension between how the Quran looks perhaps on its face versus the esoteric and inner meanings that you can draw from it, this will be a major issue of concern for us as well as some of the hadith which we discussed last week. And I would refer you to the beginning of the discussion of last week when we talked about Hadith Qudsi, this claim that there's extra Quranic revelation that comes through the Prophet in the speech of God is at least what the attribution is, and how the Hadith Qudsi are rejected by some of the Muslim by a hefty chunk of Muslims, and then alternatively reaffirmed by Muslims as well. So there's this tension in hadith questions of the hadith. Also, what we're going to do a little bit and spend a little bit of time on is how Muslims see the prophet. So today, by and large, our way of looking at the prophet is sort of takes on the heroic model of European history, and in addition, it has takes particular pains to divorce Muhammad from any miraculous activities or ecstatic activities or healing activities, which were quite present in the Islamic tradition throughout history, but which in the modern period we see largely not being discussed by Muslims, at least in their mosques and places of worship, but being discussed at great length by Sufis in their lodges. So this might be something we need to account for as well, and also just the idea of descent of knowledge and why that's important to understanding Islam. We're going to get into that a little bit too. And then, in this sort of tradition of looking at some saints or looking at some Sufi masters, in the second half of the class, we're going to be looking particularly closely at a particularly infamous figure, Mansur Halaj, and his life and times, and how he's understood, misunderstood, and then also why that would be the case. That there's a lot of debate and discussion over his legacy. All right. So the first spot for us to go is to the Quran, and in the passages I have here, and you'll notice that these are two translations of the same passage. There are going to be some words that the translator, in the first case, Carl Ernst, and in the second case, Sayyid Wali Nasser, are going to be a little bit different. And now, for those of you who are interested in studying Islam and are familiar and capable in English, I cannot recommend highly enough the study Quran that Sayyid Wali, sorry, Sayyid Hussein Nasser has been responsible for translating. It's available through Wiley Blackwell. Um, it sits on top of my shelf and a number of others. It's bit of a hefty tome, and it's printed in on biblical paper, so wafer thin. But it's a very useful source for those of us that may not have familiarity with all of the interpretive traditions. So, just in terms of how Muslims read the Quran, first off, it is a very difficult text to read. There's esoteric components, there's historical components, there's portents of the Day of Judgment, there's legal clauses between 50 and 500. Some have argued there's going to be judgments, there's going to be prayers, and so as such, the document is fairly impenetrable to someone encountering it for the first time. And in fact, if you look at the declarations of Orientalists, their profound frustration with the text sort of gives you a sense of that it's not really easy to engage with unless you're growing up in a milieu which is catering it to you and to your level of understanding. And so, um, with the Quran, I very highly recommend the study Quran because the notes at the bottom of each page are going to tell you how the particular phrase in the Quran was interpreted historically in various glosses on the text. So, a real mark of a philosopher, of a thinker like Razi or just like Razi is a good one, Jafar Sadiq, they will write interpretations of the Quran, and then the analysts in this particular text submit kind of notes on every passage to tell you where to look in these commentaries to understand something. The caveats with Nasser's text is that Nasser himself is rather prominently a Muslim and a Sufi, and probably of a Shia background. And so, as a result, there is some hesitancy amongst Sunnis about reading Shia interpretations, but that really is to the loss of all of us if we close our eyes to gaining knowledge from what others have to say, and maybe even those that we disagree with. At any rate, with that caveat, let's take a look here at these two different interpretations. So the first is, He is the one who caused the book to descend upon you. Part of it is clearly defined verses, which are the quote, mother of the book, and the others are symbolic. But those with error in their hearts followed the symbolic part of it, seeking dissension and seeking its interpretation. None know its interpretation except God and those who are firmly rooted in knowledge. Others say, We have faith in it. It is all from our Lord. But none recalls except those who possess the inner heart. Okay, a couple of words here that are going to come up and be slightly problematic. This interpretation by Ernst probably relies more on the Quran of Jafar al-Sadiq, the mystical interpretation of Jafar al-Sadiq. It has been translated recently into English, otherwise it was unavailable for a very long time fully in English, but it recently through Taurus, I believe, has become available. Um, but essentially, it will often translate phrases like albab as not as understanding or intellect, which is more typically how we see it translated in Qurans, and more typically how it's understood. So, if you look at a concordance of the Quran, something that would put in parallel all the uses of a particular phrase, you would see that it shows up about 16 times in the Quran that those who know and the Sufi interpretation of this phrase is the ones who have the inner heart. And this is a combination of two kinds of knowledge. This is esoteric and exoteric knowledge, which is to say that they understand what the words mean in their context, but also they can understand the inner meaning of the words. This is a Sufi concept, but it is also used in terms of rationalist understandings of the Quran. So, in the case of the Shia, and in the case of certain philosophical groups like the Mu'tazila that we are going to encounter in Islam, and I strongly advise that if you are unfamiliar with the Mu'tazila, it's a good idea to at least look at the Wikipedia page, because it's good to have a passing familiarity with who they are, since they're going to show up a lot. Often they're called Islam's rationalists. In particular, they incorporate aspects of rational thought into how to interpret the Quran. There's a belief that rationality can lead you to a deeper understanding. So, if rationality is one of the gifts that God has given human beings, then the engagement of the rational faculties is an exercise of one of God's gifts, a laudatory thing. And of course, free thinkers have invoked that throughout history to say that that what they are saying is defended because of this giving of rationality. And you'll see even in the 20th century, certain figures like Muhammad Asad, a very famous translator of the Quran, and father of Talal Asad, an equally famous anthropologist. And Muhammad Asad actually, incidentally, for those of you who may not know, received the first passport ever from Pakistan when he was trying to form a Muslim League of Nations while working there. But Muhammad Asad actually claimed that he was a neo-Mutazili. He said that I'm a new kind of Mutazili, a new sort of rationalist. And even though, and he was using kind of Enlightenment rationalism of Europe, which he had experienced as a way of engaging with the Quranic text and trying to understand it. All right. The other translation here we have he who has sent down the book upon thee. Therein are signs for those whose hearts are given to swerving. They follow that of which is symbolic, seeking temptation and seeking its interpretation. And none know its interpretation save God and those firmly rooted in knowledge. They say, we believe in it all from our Lord, and none remember save that those that possess intellect. And so you're seeing that tension here between the inner heart and the intellect. So the Sufi interpretation will be, um, let me just back up 1 second. How do we know things, right? This is going to be something that's going to come up constantly, and we're going to spend time with the idea of epistemology all throughout the semester. So, Sufi epistemology is going to be different than Western secular epistemology, which we're studying, for example, in a university. So, a Sufi epistemology, the sense is that if we ask what is the vessel to know truth, most people would say, well, the mind, right? So, our ability to rationalize, our ability to think is how we can get to the truth. We can collect evidence, we can sift through it, we can engage with it. But the Sufi counter to that would be that the heart, is where the hub, the the nature of love, and the heart, the vessel of love, is where knowledge can really be sought. That is where the truth can be found. And so often the kind of duality between mind body, the Sufis play with that a little bit, because it's the idea that the mind can learn something, but the rationality has limits. That once you get to the end of rationality, how then can you understand the mystic? And to understand the mystic, you have to go through the heart. And so that is why they would translate those with knowledge, or those who know, as the heart. Now, the other reason why this surah is a little bit important is that it also has a reference to something which the ulama will claim. So, the ulama, for those of us who may not be aware, are the so called scholars of Islam. Their word comes from alim, which is the singular, and ilm is where the origin of that goes, and that is the word for knowledge. Now, so when both of these interpretations or translations say those firmly rooted in knowledge, the ulama have claimed that as their mantle, that they are the ones firmly rooted in knowledge. And we have to remember, at the very early period of Islam, as Islam is being revealed, it is descending over the course of about 23 years. Just going to check the chat. Oh, wonderful. Okay, just greetings to everyone. Salam. Wa alaikum assalam. So then, when we're dealing with, so where is, who are these guys? So at the very origins of Islam, we have the Prophet, and we have his followers around him. And the sense was that in this earliest phase after the death of the Prophet, the greatest reliance of authority that we had would be on that generation of people who actually followed Muhammad. And so close engagement with that generation became the easiest way to access the tradition. But as that generation begins to die out, there's going to be a whole new generation of people who have never now encountered the Prophet, and maybe never even encountered anyone who encountered the Prophet. So after about 2 or 3 generations, we have a new kind of authority beginning to emerge. And these are going to be the ulama, and they're going to assert their authority against the government. So when Western scholars make the claim that Muslims have no differentiation, and they have no concept of secularism, that there's no difference between religion and government, that is patently false. Because very, very early on in the tradition, you see the governmental understanding of Islam is going to be very different than the understanding endorsed by these kind of scholars at the ground level, and often they're going to come into conflict. So, in some cases, scholars are going to be thrown in prison for refusing to be a judge. I think this is the story of Malik, of the Maliki school. I have to confirm that, though. But essentially, what happens is a scholar would be called to be a judge, but the danger they would feel is if they are offering their opinion in public, that they would be compromising their own ethics, because they would be working for perhaps an unjust ruler. And so scholars would be thrown in prison until they would change their mind and become judges, or render opinions which were favorable to the government. So it was quite common at this early stage for thinkers who were engaging with the Quran seriously and criticizing the ways that the government was operating to be thrown in prison. So this is a very common story in this early tradition. So, when we're talking about how they know, these scholars would assume that the Quranic injunctions are actionable in this world, that life can be structured according to the law revealed by the Quran, according to the law derived through engagement with the Quran. Now, this is right about when the Sufis will enter the scene as well. So, very early on, you have Sufis sort of forming their own movement in parallel, where they're saying they're going to approach the Quran in different ways. So same time, in this point in history, we've got the government with its interpretation, we've got the Sufis with their own interpretation, the Alims with their own interpretation, the Shia with a distinct interpretation, and also other rival groups which are going to emerge and be destroyed, like the Kharijis, the sort of radical Islamic movements from this early period. So, in the first few centuries of Islam, you've got a multitude of ways of being Muslim, a multitude of ways of engaging with the tradition. In fact, Fred Donner, in his history, Muhammad and the Early Believers movement, Fred Donner argues that Muslims did not even refer to themselves as Muslims for about the first 200 years, and instead would use the term momin, which is one who believes, because there was an anxiety at the origins of Islam in terms of what its relationship would be to the other revealed traditions. So, for example, what is Islam's relationship to Judaism? What is Islam's relationship to Christianity? The Islamic self understanding is that these are a consistent revelation from God, that God is sort of giving us revelation throughout history in an attempt to communicate God's will, and that each of the prophets receives this revelation, each of these, and then over time it becomes distorted. And so the Quran represents a revitalization of the messages of all the prophets, is the Muslim self understanding. So, at least at this early phase, the Muslims are studying other languages. So, the growth of Greek learning, for example, is very intense at this early stage because there's a desire to access Christian scripture. There's also a growth in Hebrew learning at this early stage because there's a desire to figure out exactly how does Islam fit into this narrative. Also, we've got converts coming over from Judaism and Christianity, bringing their own analytical traditions into Islam as well. In addition, we're having a renegotiation with Arab culture and history. How much of Arab culture is Islamic culture, can be preserved in this new milieu? And that will be heavily debated. And of course, once we encounter Persia, everything's going to get more complicated as well. Let me just give you an example of what happens when we hit Persia. So I was having my cousin was getting married to a young Irani woman about 15 years ago, and we were in London, England, to celebrate. And during the kind of reception at their father's house, he had this beautiful apartment on Hyde Park, and I found out, was a follower of the Shah who had to leave when the revolution happened in 1979. And I was talking to him about what I work on and what I study, and he says, this eventually from Iran, this Arab fad will fade. And I was like, you mean Arab fad as in Islam, the thing that's been there for like over 1200 years? And you'd be like, yeah, eventually we'll return to Persian culture. So there's this very long memory of Persian history and culture. And also there's a sense that it was in many ways superior to the relatively backwater culture of the Arabs at that time. And so, even in the case of something like the Ottomans or the Mughals in India, you're going to have them be a Turkic governing class that uses Persian ethics and manners, but studies theology in Arabic. So, there's going to be a deeply sort of mixed up rulership taking place in places like India. All right, let's not get too far off track. Let's bring us back. So this question of those who have knowledge, as we see in the Quran here, is this question is a question of debate for the Sufis, maybe not a question of debate for Sunnis. But the other thing that's significant about this Quranic passage is it's one of the few passages in the entire Quran that describes how knowledge of the Quran works. So, how do we approach the text? How do we engage the text? And so, the text is sort of telling us that its interpretation is known to God alone and to this special class of people who have knowledge. Then we have to ask ourselves, what kind of knowledge? So, does a physicist have the kind of knowledge necessary to access the inner meaning of the Quran? I don't know. Depends on the physicist, right? In a sense, this question of what knowledge, whose knowledge, this is already at issue in the Quran. So now to in terms of Sufi interpretation, whether Sufis self-identify as Sunni or Shia or Ismaili or Ahmadi, however, whichever group they belong to of the Islamic community, there is a tendency to have a bit of a reliance on the Quranic interpretation of Jafar as-Sadiq. He is, of course, a Shia imam, and so this creates for us a little bit of a problem. So for just to as a very quick refresher, the for Sunnis and Shias, there is a tension that grows from a succession issue starting very early on. So, who should succeed the Prophet when he dies? Should it be his blood relatives, or should it be whoever is qualified or whoever is voted in by consent? And so, for the first four caliphs, there's a sense for the Shia that, except for Ali, who is related to Prophet Muhammad by blood, the rest of the caliphs might have usurped Ali's right to reign. And so that's the Shia perspective, that Ali should have been the inheritor of Muhammad's mantle. And then there's some debate among Sunnis and Shias as to whether or not the leaders of the community take on the mantle of the prophet or merely take on his political role, or do they have an interpretive role of the Quran as well? In general, when we talk about Muslim secularism, what we're referring to is that the caliphal authorities, by and large, did not also act as interpretive authorities. The interpretive communities were going to be like the ulama, like the Sufis and others, and the caliphal authority would be about implementing the law and making sure that the law was implemented and enacted. And even the word caliph has a sense of vice regency, like almost like uh, uh, it's not quite the same as a prophet, for example. They would never claim the mantle of prophethood for themselves, but they would claim the mantle of this kind of leadership. For the Shia, the scenario looks slightly different. For them, the Imams, which is to say the descendants of Muhammad, are imbued with certain spiritual insight, special insight, that inner heart that we saw in the earlier Quranic phrase, and the Imams are said to be infallible on questions of doctrine, is how it is understood by the Shias. So Jafar as-Sadiq's interpretations of the Quran are not necessarily gospel as such, but they are a very persuasive authority in interpretation. But in terms of how Shias approach the Quran, it is not only with Jafar as-Sadiq, it's with a number of Imams' interpretations, especially Ali's sermons and letters. But in addition, for the Sufis, whether they claim to be Sunni, Shia, or what have you, Sufis will read Jafar as-Sadiq's interpretation of the Quran because it's filled with this kind of esoteric meditations on how phrases in the Quran work and how stories in the Quran work. And so, for those of us seeking the meaning beyond the initially apparent meaning, Jafar as-Sadiq's analysis of the Quran is a really enlightening sort of opening of that door. And Jafar as-Sadiq will claim that Quranic interpretation operates in four modes. He'll say the Book of God has four things. First, literal expressions, ibara, allusion, ishara, subtleties, lataif, and deepest realities, hakak, haqa'iq. The illusion for the elite, the subtleties for the friends of God, and the deepest realities for the prophets. So, what he is simultaneously doing is he is saying that there are four kinds of levels of encountering the Quran. That the first is the literal, on the face black letter. The second is the illusion, what is implied, the subtlety, which may be deeper, and then the truth behind the words, the really real. Okay. And this buys into the sense in general, if you're reading the Quran, if there's a sense that this world is a test, that this world is the engagement of this world is an evaluation for where you're going to end up for the longer time, right? So if the sense is if you are a good Muslim in this world, you will get lots of bennies in the afterlife in the form of, soft cushions, wine that never gets you drunk, rivers of milk and honey, that kind of idea. Um, so the readings of the Quran will only be accessible also to certain kinds of people. And this is a little bit of Hellenic influence coming in, especially through Aristotle and Plato, and a little bit of also the self conceptualization of class as mattering in terms of interpreting the Quran. So Jafar as-Sadiq is first saying that there's four levels of understanding, but then what he is also saying is that there's going to be first the interpretation of everyday people, and that's going to be the lowest level, the awam, the like everyday kind of people. Then the elite are going to have a different kind of understanding than the everyday people. They're going to have a different access, and then the friends of God, the awliya, this is the term that Attar also uses when he writes his biography of the saints. He refers to them as the awliya. So here he is talking about the saints or those close to God. And then the deepest reality is the understanding of the prophet. Now, to this, and the prophet has direct encounter with the message of God. It's not mediated through anybody else. To this, philosophers will tend to add the understanding of the philosophers tacked on at the end. And their analysis is basically that not anyone can aim to be a prophet. You can't choose to be a prophet. Prophets are chosen, do not choose it. Um, but the difference is for the philosopher, a philosopher can actually reach the level of prophetic understanding through careful engagement of philosophical methods, and so that is. The philosophers tend to argue that their understanding is nearly as deep as the prophets. Although, if you read Islamic philosophical texts, you'll see that they're very careful about not stepping on prophetic toes. That they're going to all throughout the text talk about how beautiful, how amazing, and how deep the understanding of prophets is, while simultaneously implying that they can go just as deep, just as profound. So you'll see this a lot in Islamic texts as well. So this just gives us a sense. Again, when we're talking about epistemology, how do we know? How do people engage what is known? What we're seeing in terms of Sufi commentaries here is that Sufis understand the ways of knowing the Quran are different. Who can know is different. So the understanding of a peasant cannot be the same as the understanding of a philosopher. This ranking system is sort of may offend some of our more egalitarian, equity oriented thinking today. But this is almost universal in terms of Hellenized philosophy that was influenced by the Hellenic thinkers, all have these ranking systems built into them. And so do the Confucians. So from the other end, too. Okay, let's work a little bit with this very interesting prophetic figure. The image here on the left is an image from the Mughal era. It's a miniature from a manuscript, and this figure, Al Khidir, or the Green One, is what his name means. Is he shows up in the Quran in regards to one particularly important story about Moses. And what happens is that Moses, and we suspect his companion, who the interpreters think is the prophet Joshua, encounters this figure Al Khidir when he's boasting about his own knowledge. So Moses is saying, I understand the world and the way things work, and he is told to go and seek out Al Khidir as a lesson to almost humble him. Um, and so this little narrative transpires. So I'm going to be reading from Nasser's translation here. We're going to start on Surah 18, Al-Khaf, starting with Ayah 60, and he's going to and let's jump into this narrative. And when Moses said to his servant, I shall continue on until I reach the junction of two seas, even if I journeyed for a long time. And when they reached the junction of the two, they forgot their fish, and it made its way to the sea, burrowing away. Then, when they had passed beyond, he said to his servant, bring us our meal. We have certainly met with weariness on this journey of ours. He said, didn't thou see? We took refuge at the rock, and I forgot the fish, and naught made me neglect to mention it save Satan. And then it made its way to the sea in a most wondrous manner. He said, that is what we were seeking. So they turned back and retraced their steps. And when they reached there, they found a servant from amongst our servants. And this vague reference, the servant from amongst our servants, is thought to be Al Khadir, this figure in the image here. So they found a servant from amongst our servants who had gained a mercy from us and who we had taught knowledge from our presence. Moses said to him, shall I follow thee that thou might teach me some of that which thou hast been taught of sound judgment? The servant replied, truly, thou wilt not be able to bear patiently with me. So the servant is warning Moses here at the start of their journey that I have a feeling that you don't have the patience to learn what I know. And also, significantly here, Moses, of course, who is sitting at the pinnacle of the law because he receives the law, is humbling himself before a figure who perhaps knows more than him. Then he says, um, thou wilt find me patient, if God wills, and I shall not disobey thee in any matter. He says, then if you would follow me, question me not about anything until I mention it to thee, says Al Khidir. So they went on until they had embarked on a ship. And then he made a hole in the ship. And Moses asked, did thou make a hole in this ship in order to drown the people on this boat? You have done a monstrous thing. Khidir replies, did I not say to thee that you would not be able to bear patiently with me? Then he said, take me not to task for having forgotten, says Moses. Don't make me suffer any hardship on account of what I've done. So they continued journeying until they met a young boy, and Al Khidir slew him. And then he said, Moses cried out, did you slay a poor soul who has slain no other soul? Thou hast certainly done a terrible thing. Khidir replied, did I not say to thee that thou would not be able to bear patiently with me? Moses says, if I question thee concerning any more after this, then I shall keep your company no more. You has attained sufficient excuse from me. So they went on until they came to a town and sought food from there. But the town refused to show them any hospitality. And then therein they found a wall about to fall down. So Khidir set it up straight. And he said, has thou willed, thou could have taken a wage from it, says Moses, for fixing that wall. Khidir replies, this is the parting between you and me. I'm going to inform thee of the meanings of the things that you could not understand. Firstly, for the ship. It belonged to an indigent people who worked the sea. I desired to damage the ship because just beyond them was a king who was seizing every ship by force. As for the young boy, his parents were believers, so we feared that he would make them suffer through rebellion and disbelief. So we desired that their Lord give them in exchange one who is better than him in purity and nearer in mercy. And as for the wall, it belonged to two orphan boys in the city, and beneath it was a treasure belonging to them. Their father was righteous, and the Lord desired that they should reach maturity and extract that treasure as a mercy of the Lord. This I did upon my own command. This is the meaning of what thou could not bear patiently. All right, let's explain. All right, so Moses meets this guy, Al Khidir. And the story of the fish right before is a little interesting too. So Moses and Joshua have brought dried fish with them while they're on this journey. Apparently, they discover a well of healing, and the dried fish drinks the water of the well, comes to life, dives into the earth, and burrows its way out to the sea. After seeing this extraordinary thing, Joshua keeps very quiet. And then when Moses asks him what happened to our dinner, he says, "Oh, it sort of ran off in a most miraculous fashion. They continue on their journey. They meet this character, Al Khidir. Al Khidir tells Moses that you can learn from me, but ultimately you will not understand the things that I do, and worse yet, you're going to question my actions at every turn. They sail on a ship. Al Khidir he damages the ship. Moses says, "What's going on? Why are you doing that?" Al Khidir says, "Didn't I tell you that you wouldn't be able to keep quiet until this journey was over?" Next, Al Khidir kills a young boy. And Moses says, "Why'd you do that? That's monstrous." And Al Khidir replies again, "Didn't I tell you you wouldn't be able to keep quiet until we got to the end of this journey?" Then Al Khidir repairs a wall of a city that was very cruel to them. And Moses asks again, "Why'd you do that?" And he says, "Oh, I'm done with you. Our knowledge cannot meet." So this is what we have here is the Sufi interpretation of the relationship between Moses and Al Khidir is the interpretation of the journey for seeking knowledge. For example, the way that they understand the phrase in the Quran, when the two seas meet, on the one hand, the surface level meaning could be where two oceans come together, where actually two seas meet. Alternatively, Al Razi, for example, has interpreted it to mean one sea is Moses, the sea of the law, the sea of the interpretation which says, do this and you will get the goodies. So Moses is the representative of the law, and Al Khidir is the representative of the esoteric inner knowledge, inner meaning, because uh, Al Khidir performs the actions without asking why. But Moses cannot but ask why because he is a creature of the law. And so what the Sufi interpretation of this narrative is it is the clashing of two different epistemological systems. The epistemology of the law, the way that the law approaches the world, structures the world, understands action, versus the way that the mystic approaches the world, which is to say the mystic doesn't ask why, but just performs. Um, so here, between these two sides is a certain tension. And in fact, ultimately, the law is frustrated to the point that it gives up and the mystic leaves. So Moses does not become uh, quite the mystic in this encounter. Al Khidir is an important figure. Again, he is not mentioned in the Quranic account, but a lot of interpreters imply that it is him. He is thought to be sort of an undying figure who shows up to guide different people throughout history. So Sufis will think of him almost as a figure in occlusion, someone who's in a separate, hidden world, who comes to bring wisdom and learning. Alternatively, he's thought to have been a man who lived and died. Elsewhere, he's thought to be a Mahdiist figure. He's thought to return kind of near the end of days. So he is filled with esoteric stories about him. And he features very prominently, in particular in devotional texts, because he is someone who has greater knowledge of a fashion than Moses. And that's quite a claim. And the only way that he could have greater knowledge than Moses would be for him himself to be a prophetic figure, because the ranking of knowledge, of course, has the knowledge of the prophets at the highest, as we mentioned in the last slide. So for anyone to even compare to the knowledge of Moses, they would need to be on the same level. Okay, so what the other thing that this sets up is take, for example, the biblical phrase, we are fools for the sake of Christ. In that case, holy men in places like Russia, for example, the Yerodve, or a Saint Simeon, or the other Syriac church fathers, often an important aspect of their practice was to do things which don't seem normally acceptable to other people. So they are performing acts which others cannot understand and cannot engage with and that don't make sense to them, right? This why are you doing that? It seems to be the question that Moses is asking over and over again. And for Sufis, often their actions, if they claim that they are divinely inspired, that they wouldn't make sense to the uninitiated or to those who don't have the inner heart. And so this clash that you're seeing play out between Moses and Al-Khidir is actually the ways that Sufis understand the clash between the strict conformity to the Sharia and the deeper esoteric understanding. They trace this directly to this account in Surah 18. Okay. Um, Now let's move on to the Prophet Muhammad, and in his case, where does the kind of mystic or esoteric tradition draw itself from? So, firstly, um, mystics relate very deeply to the nature of revelation itself. So, in the case of the Prophet Muhammad, the way that revelation descended upon him becomes a very important aspect of Sufi meditation. Let me pull up my text here. Pardon me for just a sec. Okay, here we go. So let me read to you a little bit about what happens with Revelation so you can get a sense of how the Quran is revealed. This is the account of from the life of the Prophet by Ibn Ishaq. Now, Ibn Ishaq is considered to be a pretty good historian from this early period, but he is writing history in the same way that Matthew is writing history. Matthew is interested in putting Jesus in the context of all of Jewish history and how he sort of has come to complete the law. That is extremely important in Matthew, so much so that Matthew has Jesus riding two animals simultaneously when he when he enters the city, because Jesus is meant to ride a donkey and the child of a donkey, and so Matthew doesn't want the law to be wrong, so he has Jesus ride both simultaneously. If you want to imagine what that would look like, it might be quite humorous. At any rate, this is the equivalent of a Matthew. He is arguing about how the Islamic prophets fit in history. And in the case of Muhammad, he is sort of casting him in that larger light. And so there's mystic stories about people having a sense that Muhammad is coming, especially a Christian monk named Bahira, and some other figures are going to show up in this story. In addition, the other thing that Ibn Ishaq does is he's going to quote stories and encounters in this sirah, in this literature about the life of the Prophet. But one of the problems is Ibn Ishaq is notorious because he was not considered a good hadith reciter. He was not considered good for his hadith knowledge, but he was considered good for his historical knowledge. So what you are seeing in the case of early Islam is that there's actually a subdivision of who has the knowledge on what. So he is allowed to talk about the life of the prophet, but his the what he claims the prophet said may or may not have validity. So at this time, when this is being written and within the first 2 or 3 centuries of Islam, there is already a deep consciousness that the tradition needs to be protected in some ways from extrapolation or too much input coming from outside. So there's this nervousness about that already. If you want to read about this, Shahab Ahmed has a book on the Satanic verses, and he discusses at length how early epistemological theory works in Islam. So if that is of interest to you, I very, very highly recommend that book by Shahab Ahmed. But in addition, let's dig into this. Okay. When it was the night, this is from Guillaume's translation of this book from page 106. When it was the night on which God honored him with his mission and showed him mercy on his servants thereby, Gabriel brought him the command of God. He came to me, said the apostle of God, while I was asleep, with a coverlet of brocade whereon there was some writing. And he said to me, Read, Iqra. I said, What should I read? He pressed me so tightly that I thought it was death. Then he let me go. And he said, Iqra. I said, What shall I read? He pressed me with it again. And then he let me go and said, Read. And I said, What shall I read? He pressed me a third time so that I thought it was death. And then said, Read. And then I asked again, What shall I read? And this I said only to deliver myself from him, lest he should do the same to me again. Then I recited, read in the name of thy Lord who created man of blood coagulated. Read thy Lord is the most beneficent, who taught by the pen, who taught that which they did not know unto men. This is the beginning of Surah, first 5 lines of Surah 96, which is largely considered to be some of the earliest revelation of the Quran. So I read it, and then the figure departed from me. And then I woke from my sleep, and it was through these words that were written on my heart. Now, none of God's creatures was more hateful to me than an ecstatic poet or a man possessed. Never shall the Quraysh say this of me. I will go to the top of the mountain and I will throw myself down. I may kill myself and gain rest. So I went forth to do so, and then when I was midway on the mountain, I heard a voice from heaven crying, O Muhammad, thou art the apostle of God, and I am Gabriel. I raised my head towards heaven to see who was speaking, and lo, Gabriel appeared in the form of the man with feet astride the horizon, saying, O Muhammad, thou art the apostle of God, and I am Gabriel. I stood gazing at him, moving neither forward nor backward, and then I began to turn my face away from him, but toward whatever region of the sky I looked, I saw him as before. And I continued standing there, neither advancing nor turning back, until Khadija, Muhammad's wife, sent her messengers in search of me, and they gained the high place. And then he parted from me, and I from him, returning to my family. And then I came to Khadija and sat upon her thigh and drew close to her. She said, O Abu al Qasim, where hast thou been? By God, I sent my messengers in search of thee, and they searched the high ground above Mecca, and then they returned to me. And I said to her, woe is me, poet or possessed. She said, I take refuge from God, from that, O Abu al Qasim. God would not treat you thus, since he knows your truthfulness, your great trustworthiness, your fine character, and your kindness. This cannot be, my dear. Perhaps you did see something. Then I told her of what I had seen, and she said, rejoice, O son of my uncle, and be of good heart. Verily, by him whose hand is Khadija's soul, I hope that thou wilt be the prophet of this people. Then she rose and gathered about her garments and set to confirm with her cousin Waraka. So, in this account of the very early prophetic biography, we have this first sort of mystical encounter, which is the revelation of the Quran itself. And it is tied in particular in Muslim tradition to a mystical night, the so called Laylat al Qadr, the night of power, the night of the Quran's descent. So, on that night is a night filled with sort of mixed mystic expectation, as a child, we were encouraged to spend the whole night awake in prayer, and your wish would be granted if you spent the whole night in prayer. I as a child, you think that it's like Santa Claus, right? And so that you can cycle any kind of prayer into a wish. So one night I very intensely stayed up on Laylat al-Qadr, and I prayed for a box of Fruity Pebbles, um, because I had never seen American cereal, but I saw it advertised in Archie comics. And I said this what felt to me very sincere, but of course, Fruity Pebbles did not appear, and all the better for me, actually, because they're monstrous. No one should be eating them. Um, all right, one other one. Sorry, yes, Saber Rajid Raji, you are correct in saying Ikra is the imperative form of read, as in the command to read. Thank you. All right, let me get into one other mystic experience that the prophet has, and then after this next account, we'll take our break for 10, and then we'll return to round out our time. So here we have the night journey. Now, again, for those of us who may not be aware, during Muhammad's ministry, there's a question as to when the Quran was revealed. Was it revealed in toto to him on that night up in the mountain when he first received the first revelation, and then did it unfold in his mind, or did the veils peel away in his mind, or alternatively, did he receive the revelation constantly over the course of 23 years? In most accounts, the sense is that Muhammad is conducting his life and living his life, and over the course of that 23 years, he is interrupted by revelation. Um, Oh, great. Let me just pull up the Q&A. Is Muhammad's name mentioned in the Bible? There's a question in the chat. To the best of my knowledge, no. Muhammad's name is not mentioned in the Bible, but I suspect that question is deeper than I'm giving it credit for. So I will look into that question, and I will perhaps give you a better response next week as to what that might be scratching at. Okay. Let me begin this discussion of this is the night when Muhammad has his mystical journey or miraculous journey. Let me give you the version from Ibn Ishaq. We'll just chat about it and then take our break. The Night Journey and the Ascent into Heaven. This is page 181 in Guillaume's translation. For those of you who are also interested in acquiring Guillaume's translation, on archive.org, I believe copies of it are available for free as a PDF. The typesetting is a bit screwy on that older version, but it's all there. Okay. All right. The Night Journey and the Ascent to Heaven. Okay. Uh, I was told the following. The apostle was carried by night from the mosque at Mecca to the Masjid al-Aqsa, which is the temple of Aliyah, where Islam had spread to Mecca amongst the Quraysh and all the tribes. So the Masjid al-Aqsa means the distant mosque, and many understand it to mean a location near Jerusalem. The following account reached me. The matter and place of the journey and what was said about it is a searching test and a matter of God's power and authority, wherein a lesson for the intelligent and a guidance and the mercy for strengthening those who believe. Now, again, that lesson for the intelligent is that same stuff we were referring to earlier. I was certainly an act of God by which he took him by night in a way in which he pleased, to show him his signs which he willed him to see, so that he had witnessed his mighty sovereignty and power by which he does what he wills to do. According to what I have heard, Abdullah bin Masud used to say, Borak, the animal whose every stride carried it as far as the eye could reach, on which the prophets before him used to ride, was brought down to the apostle and he mounted it. His companion Gabriel went with him to see the wonders of heaven and earth until he came to Jerusalem's temple. There he found Abraham, the friend of God, Moses and Jesus assembled with a company of the prophets, and he prayed with them. Then he was brought three vessels containing milk, wine, and water. The apostle said, I heard a voice saying that when these were offered to me, if he takes the water, he will be drowned and his people also. If he takes the wine, he will go astray and his people also. If he takes the milk, he'll be rightly guided and his people also. So I took the vessel containing the milk and drank it. And Gabriel said to me, You have been rightly guided, and so will your people be, O Muhammad. I was told that Al Hassan said the apostle said, When I was sleeping in the Hijr, Gabriel came to me and stirred me with his foot. When I sat up and saw nothing, I lay down again. He came a second time and stirred me with his foot, and I lay down. I sat up and saw nothing and lay down again. He came a third time and stirred me with his foot. I sat up and he took hold of my arm, and I stood behind him, and he brought me out of the door at the mosque. There was a white animal, half mule, half donkey, with wings on its side, which propelled its feet, putting down on each forefoot at the limit of its sight, and he mounted me on it, and then he went out, keeping me close to him. So this account continues of the prophet then ascending through the stages of heaven until he has an encounter with the divine. And this account actually was unnerving for a lot of early Muslims because it didn't really fit with the other stuff that Muhammad was saying. In the very early period, when we're going to talk about the first 10 or so years in Mecca, we have to remember that the prophetic message at this stage is he is warning people, he is cautioning them, he is calling them to pay heed to what he is saying, he is warning them about the end of days. If you are looking at the Quran in terms of legal content, that stuff is going to come from the second half of his ministry, the 10 or so years that he is going to spend in Medinat al Nabi or Yathrib or Medina, When he gets there, the time that he spends in that city is the time in which he's going to be an administrator, a giver of law, someone who runs a government. But in the case of Mecca, he is still a subaltern prophet, a prophet who is weak because of his connections within his community have become frayed by his preaching. And now all of a sudden, he is coming out and telling his followers that he's taken a mystic journey in which he traveled on a magical horse to Jerusalem and then up through the heavens. This seriously concerns people, and they caution him about the telling of this story. But ultimately, they come around to it and they start endorsing it. And as you can see, the story has all of the requisite elements also for a deeper mystical philosophical interpretation. This offering of the three vessels of wine, milk, and water, the encounter of the prophets of Abraham and Jesus. Also, later in the story, he will encounter Moses. So, as such, he is encountering all of the major markers and the kinds of names that in the intellectual milieu of the time would have had very high appeal. And so, as such, this is the other prophets validating Muhammad's mission. And so it becomes in time a very, very important story in the Islamic history, but also the ground, sort of the entry level for how to look at mystical experience in Islam generally. That there's elements of travel, that there's elements of encounter, that there's elements of whether or not you have the will to go on this journey. The journey may take you on it anyway. All right. I have an image here of the Burak as well from the Deccan in India. This was produced between the 17th and 18th. Let me just double check here on the dates. Yes, this was produced in the 1770s. And what you can see here is that this is pretty typical of this Deccan style, is that the Burak is made up of, is first off like this winged creature. Um, that's magical, but here it also is made up of other animals, and this is a pretty typical of the style in the Deccan at the time, that they would take other animals and they would meld it in to make other forms. And so you can see here that the elephant especially is the heart of the creature right at the second center. It's the most vibrant, and it also incidentally is the symbol of kingly power. And so it comes as no surprise that those who want to kind of give some shine to the king would want to put his symbols into their images as well. And so, with this last picture, let's take a 10-minute break. I will put up a timer. I will pause the recording. We will come back in a brief 10 minutes and resume. Thank you for your attention and your energy. I realize that, as always, I'm throwing a lot at you, and I hope that it's digesting. See you soon. So just for a brief check-in with everyone, is the stuff that we have said thus far in the class making sense to you? Are people following along with the discussion that we're having? Because I would hate for you to get lost and me not have found you. So let's try to make sure that we're keeping the lines of communication open, especially for the students at St. Mary's, but also for members of the public. Please just let me know if anything comes up that you would like further explained, further elaborated on. And even if I don't have the answer right now, I will make every effort to try and get an answer for you by the next class. Any questions at this stage? Nope. General head shaking. No. All right. That's fine by me. Let us continue then. Let us dip right back into this. So, so far, we've discussed some of the Quranic origins for what Sufis will use to justify their actions, their mysticism, their approach of knowledge. In the second phase, we talked a little bit about how the prophetic example and the nature of the Quran is a mystical encounter, also to a lesser extent for everyday Muslims. It's important to keep in mind that the encounter of the Quran in and of itself is a mystical experience. And what I mean by that is not to say that it's a humble experience or not as impressive, but that for believing Muslims, the Quran is the Word of God. And so encountering it is an invitation or time spent in the presence of the divine, if that makes sense. And so the daily prayers that we perform are part of that supplication, part of that engagement with that relationship. But whereas most Muslims consider their prayer complete at the end of your rakats, at the end of your parts of your prayer, for the Sufis, their sense is that what the law requires and what sort of tradition requires does not get us close enough to where I want to be. So the Sufi would say we go beyond that because we want to encounter the divine here and now, not at the end of days, not after time, not when all my deeds have been evaluated. It's this hunger for the union with the divine now. And what we saw in the earliest tradition of Iraq is, in particular, we saw that there is this fear and trembling. And now with Halaj, it's going to start shifting into the love traditions which are more commonly associated with Sufism. All right. To get to that, our story is going to take us in and around uh, the, the Iraq and Persia. And here is just a little example of a map from of Baghdad between 767 and 912. And what you see here is I was just trying to illustrate a point that Persianate architecture is now combining with Islamicate slash Arab architecture. And the Persianate architecture in this case is the round part of the city in the center, and the Arab elements are these are the parts of the city which are growing beyond it. And so too, in some of the cases with mysticism, there's this combination of Persianate and Arabicate sort of worlds coming together and melding together. So I thought this was an interesting way to explain or display that the unity of those two systems. Um, so, just as I had mentioned earlier, that the prophet is sometimes viewed as a mystical figure. In some of the accounts, there's books dedicated to prophetic miracles. Prophet Muhammad is in some cases claimed to have the ability to converse with animals, to hear their complaints of injustice. In other cases, there's stories related to the possible splitting of the moon and tree stumps and things crying out to him and engaging with him. For example, once he performs a prayer in which he was using a tree stump as part of his mimbar, as part of where he preaches from, and then when he stopped using it, the tree stump filed a complaint with him. And so, in the kind of Islamic milieu of this time period, it is not unusual for us to have a lot of mystical stories about Muhammad. In the present, however, Muhammad has increasingly evolved in the present into something of a Protestant Ubermensch, like the idea that he is uh, excellent in knowledge, excellent in manners, but just a man, and the insistence that he's just a man, but for one miracle, and that singular miracle is the miracle of the Quran. Any other miraculous accounts are discredited, and also, miraculous accounts in general are easy to discredit given our rational proclivities today, right? We are much more likely to believe accounts which are plausibly scientifically feasible as opposed to miraculous accounts. So take for example, Jesus walking on the water. There's a desire for us to imagine a sandbank beneath his feet as opposed to him performing something miraculous, right? In the same way, in the Quranic traditions, there's going to be a deep desire to scrub out the miraculous elements of Muhammad and isolate his miracle to the revelation of the Quran. However, historically and in pragmatic practice, Muslims have venerated Muhammad. And this also explains a little bit of the reticence of Muslims when it comes to depicting images of their prophet. It has been practiced in Islamic societies with caution and care. And so most of the images that we have extant today of Muhammad come from illuminated manuscripts which were created for elite patrons and something not to be viewed by the public. There weren't statues erected of Muhammad in cities. There were not large public paintings of him available for viewing. That was not really the scene in Islamic lands. Whereas veneration of Jesus is something seen as quite significant in terms of Christian practice, veneration of Muhammad took some different forms. So, one of the ways that people would venerate and remember Muhammad is by having exuberant birthday celebrations for him. And these birthday celebrations are extremely well attested in both Orientalist and in native accounts. But we see that, especially nowadays in the modern era, due to the very extensive influence of petrodollars, the scope of what constitutes Islam has narrowed considerably because of this Protestantized version of Islam that is very aggressively promoted by, in particular, the Saudi royal family and their kind of subordinates and affiliates throughout the Middle East. A particular version of Islam has come to dominate, which we'll see where how it fits in or where it'll go historically, but it is distinct to the scope of what constitutes Islam historically. What we are encountering today in terms of the Saudi basic program is quite different than what Islam would have been historically. And so there's always this tension. But so when we say, what is Islam? I would have to also ask, when are we talking about, right? So what is Islam in the ninth century versus what is Islam in the 11th century versus what is Islam today in a mosque on Chibukto Road, right? So those are not going to be consistent, even though believers will want to assert that as a thread of consistency throughout the tradition. And the reason why the sort of Protestantization of Islam takes place is primarily because of colonialism and the interaction of colonialism. Colonialism privileges certain kinds of knowledges, stresses textuality, stresses a certain Enlightenment understanding of historical figures. And that's what we have today in terms of what most people are talking about in terms of Muhammad, is Islam reshaped by the colonial encounter. What falls away in particular are the miraculous stories of the prophet and celebrations of things like the prophet's birthday, because as part of their expansion, the Saudi royal family's allegiance with Ibn Wahab and his followers destroyed a lot of historical sites of Islam. So, for example, the Prophet's mausoleum in Medina was razed to the ground because they did not want to encourage veneration of the Prophet. But in doing that act, they also destroyed a historic shrine. And so there was a human cry when, for example, the Taliban decided that they were going to launch rockets at Buddhist shrines in Afghanistan. Um, we have to remember that the same people who are running governments in the Middle East now were doing the same sort of thing about 100 years ago. All right. In addition, what we are going to encounter is one aspect of how we know that there were these veneration cults or intense veneration of the prophet taking place as well. There are a number of relics all throughout the Muslim world. In particular, you're going to have relics like some mosques will have a single beard hair preserved that they claim belongs to the prophet, or alternatively, in this mosque in Eyüp, in the Sultan Mosque in Turkey, uh, you have a so-called footprint of the Prophet. I see a question in the chat saying, "What is Islam right after Muhammad passed into paradise?" I'm a little bit unsure of what that question means. So if the person who wrote the question wouldn't mind revising it a bit so that it's a bit clearer, and I would be happy to give it a shot. Um, But in terms of this image here, if you just take a look, there is a footprint embossed in here. So the big toe is here. You've got little divots here for the other toes, and the back of the heel is sort of here. And the legend is that the prophet is said to have stepped on a number of stones and that made an impression of his foot on them. And there's a number of these artifacts on display in Topekapi Museum. There's others in Damascus, and there's a few in Turkey as well. Especially this relic of the footprint, because it's claimed when he goes on his night journey and he arrives in Jerusalem that he puts his foot down, and it creates an impression of his foot as he's ascending up into heaven. And so these relics are meant to be linked to that story. Now, whether or not they're authentic, whether or not they're real, or what they are, we're not sure. But what we can say definitively is that people have venerated these as relics of the prophet. Okay. The other thing is that for Muhammad, is that in the modern period, he will evolve into an exemplar of every action. So we can say, for example, that he's an exemplar of governance. He's an exemplar of being an excellent merchant. He's an exemplar of thought, an exemplar of compassion. And so for the Sufis, it's unsurprising that they would also make him an exemplar of the mystical path as well. And veneration of the prophet features rather prominently, and you will find that in music like qawwali and other forms, that there will be a joyous celebration of him, of Ali, and of God. Those three figures will tend to show up a great deal. Okay, let me move on. So let's now discuss the death and life of Mansur Halaj. So he is a very polarizing figure in Islamic history. Um, right. So I sorry, I just there's a question in the chat that is asking, what is Islam right after Muhammad has passed into paradise? There was right after there was no Prophet Muhammad as an exemplar of government and spiritual journey. This would depend when he passes. So for example, the night journey is his ascension into heaven and then return to earth. And then after that, he becomes the head of government when he gets to Medina, because the night journey takes place while he's still in Mecca. So it takes place in the first 10 or 11 years. And then when he moves to Medina, he's already had that encounter. As opposed to after Muhammad's ascension into heaven, after he passes from this world, um, there's a sense that who will take the reins. And so the Sunnis devise a method by consultation, by shura, and the Shias develop a system by blood relationship. I hope that answers the question. I will circle back to it near the end when we have a bit more time for discussion. But let me give us Halaj's account at this point, and then I'll circle back if there's more on that question. Okay. Back to the death and life of Mansur Halaj. One thing that's significant is this is taking place again within the first 500 or so years after the death of Muhammad. So this is taking place in 858 and 922, and of course 622 or so is when the Islamic calendar is going to start. So this is about 200 odd years after. If you remember, we discussed in our initial assessment of Rabia and of Hassan al-Basri, these kind of figures who were devotional figures, perhaps even credited with being able to perform miraculous acts, but their devotion was focused on a fear of God and cultivating an intense fear of the end of days and of Judgment Day, and wanting to make oneself right in the world for the purpose of approaching God. And what we have in the case of Mansur Halaj is that Islam has recently expanded out to include parts of now the Persian empires, the former Zoroastrian controlled regions. The Muslims have defeated the Persians in battle, and as such have taken over large swaths of the previous Persian Empire. Um, and with the takeover of this area, there is an encouragement to convert. And often the narratives of Islam are that conversion was done by the sword. And we find that in some cases this may have been true, in particular when dealing with non people of the book. Now, this is a term we've used a few times in the past, the Ahl al Kitab, the idea that the peoples who have a book or the peoples who have received a previous prophet have some special place in the rank of human beings, that they are not quite Muslims, but because they're people of the book, they should be allowed to keep their religion. They shouldn't be coerced to leave it. So the regions where Islam expands now are Zoroastrians. But what we see is that a large number are beginning to convert, maybe because of tax burdens, maybe because of encouragement, or alternatively just identifying with the message of Islam. It speaks to them, and so they convert. In the case of Mansur al-Hallaj, his father converts, his grandfather does not, and he still has interaction with both of them, giving us a sense that in this milieu, there wasn't a wholesale rejection of the ways of our ancestors, but at the same time, there was a sense that participating in this new community means partially rejecting the old. Um, so the the eh, the kind of nuts and bolts of Halaj are that he was born in Persia and he travels extensively. He's famous for this declaration in which he claims "Ana al-Haq," in which he says, "I am the truth." It is an argument from the Sufi perspective that Halaj has achieved a union with the divine and is declaring that as an egoless statement, but it is understood by a majority of scholars to be his claiming of divinity, hence punishable. But that's not the entirety of the story. There's a lot more that Halaj does that gets him into trouble, and we'll go into that discussion shortly. In addition, he is a social activist, in particular during a rebellion that's taking place, and he spends time with some of the luminaries in place, such as Junaid in Baghdad, the progenitor of the so-called sober Sufi tradition, as opposed to Bezad, who's the proponent of the so-called drunken Sufi tradition. Now, this sober versus drunken varieties is a subcategory derived by scholars in about this contemporaneous period, about the 900s or so, for figuring out what kind of Sufis are around. Junaid is from Baghdad, and he encourages a very sober, very rationalistic, thoughtful engagement of the traditions, and Bezad is doing the opposite. He's dancing, he's in states of ecstasy. He claims to ejaculate while he's lost in an ecstatic union with God. So he's kind of an extreme figure as opposed to Junaid, who's the much more sober figure. So we've got these extremes already emerging when Halaj comes on the scene. And in this image that we have here on the left, this is again another one of these illustrated images. Halaj is a very famous figure. And here it shows him at the gallows with different kind of figures around him. And let me give you a bit of his life story at this stage. Okay, so he's born into this family. Father converted, grandfather has not converted, and he grows up studying the law. In fact, he studies in the Hanbali tradition, and is kind of well trained in it until he feels he reaches the limit of his learning, and then he begins his travels. So initially, he's going to go to Basra, and he's going to encounter people like Amr Maki and Junaid, and then he's going to spend some time going back between Basra and Baghdad. And while he's in Basra, and he's learning also about the traditions of Hassan al Basra, which is the guy we discussed last time, the fear and trembling approach to God. Um, but at about this time, a revolt is brewing as well. And so this is important to keep in mind, is that there's a number of social and political upheavals taking place simultaneously. We have the so-called Sunni, we have the proto-Shia at this point. It's a little bit hard to determine whether they're referred to exclusively as just Shia at this time, but so I'll use the term proto-Shia. So at this early phase, the Shia and the Sunnis are or proto-Shia are at loggerheads. They're conflicting. In addition, you've got mystics going around. In addition, you've got Zoroastrians, you've got Christians, and all of these others, and you have emergent philosophies, like you have the Mutazila, who are now talking about rationality. At the same time, in Baghdad, there is a massive translation house for translation of Greek philosophy into Arabic. So there's a huge translation effort taking place at this time as well. And so there's re-encounters of the past through Plato and Aristotle and the Stoics. And in addition, um, you've got philosophical engagements, you've got political engagements, you've got mystical engagements. So a lot of exciting stuff is taking place at the same time. And in the middle of all of that, the wealthy families in and around Basra decide that they're going to start importing a large number of dark skinned black slaves from Africa to use for labor in salt fields near Basra. And the treatment of these slaves is particularly brutal. And Mansur Halaj becomes involved in this stuff too. And in fact, this is going to be a marker of saintliness with Halaj and other kind of worldly participants and ascetics, is that they're going to get involved in social justice issues. And so in this particular case, the salt field workers are preparing to revolt, and he sides with them. And so he gets labeled as a bit of a troublemaker early on. Although the revolt rises to the point of nearly pushing the caliph out, it is brutally, brutally crushed, and Halaj has to end up fleeing. At this point, he makes his first trip to Mecca. During the course of his life, he will make 3 trips there. And unlike today, in which Muslims take the whirlwind tour of Mecca, where we go, perform the rites and rituals, say our prayers, and come back in a very, very short amount of time. At the time of Halaj, and to a certain extent for the time for elites today, when they go to Mecca, they stay for prolonged periods. So Halaj, during some trips, would stay 1 year, sometimes would stay 3 years. And the reason being is that Mecca becomes a center for advanced learning. So if you are going to study in Mecca, you are also going to have encounters with the luminaries of your age. And so you can learn a great deal. And we see that Halaj's thought and kind of approaches to mysticism evolve through his encounters with Mecca. In addition, he's going to take extensive travel. Some people are going to claim that he goes as far as China. He will spend time in and around India. He will go. He will spend time with Buddhists, with Hindu, with well, so-called Hindus, and I say so-called because I'm not sure that the term is historically accurate to his time period. So he would spend time with Christians and Zoroastrians and others, and so there's also claims that a lot of his approaches to Islam are heavily influenced by these outside factors, which for the so-called orthodox would find offensive. And I say that with scare quotes because that's not generally an appropriate term in Islam. So he spends time traveling around. He's absorbing aspects of philosophy. He's absorbing aspects of these other traditions. And then he is going to start writing poetry as well. He's going to write verse like the following, where he's going to say, I have tried to be patient, but how can my heart be patient when the center is gone? Your spirit has mixed with my spirit little by little, by turns through reunions and abandons, and now I am yourself. Your existence is my own, and it is also my will. You have ruled my heart, and I have wandered into every wadi. Dry riverbed. My heart is closed, and I have lost all sleep. I am exiled alone. How long will my solitude last? So, as you can see in this poetry, in this phase, he's getting a sense of longing. He's searching and seeking mystical union. And this was translated by, my apologies, let me give you a source for this, Herbert Mason's book on Al Halaj. Herbert Mason is one of the most important English translators of Halaj. He wrote a book in 78 on him and then again in the 2000s. And he was a very close friend of Louis Massignon, who sort of unearthed Halaj for the modern age in a very impressive way in a 5 volume work on Mansur Halaj, in which he vetted and searched out a number of Arabic sources and translated them. So if you want to encounter Halaj yourself, the sources I would go with are Mason or Massignon, depending on whether or not you have French. French for Massignon is probably the is the starting point if you want to learn more about Halaj, barring his own works, Divan al Halaj, for example. Okay, let us continue. So this question of divine union is beginning to circulate, and right about at this stage, Halaj starts getting more involved in criticizing the government. Now, generally, because of hadiths like the following, there's a hadith claimed that the Prophet Muhammad once says that 40 years of tyranny is better than 1 year of chaos, and the indication is that even if you are suffering under a bad government, the bad government in some ways is more tolerable than the chaos that would flow from a revolution. This informs some of the quietism that we see to this day in the Middle East, and in some cases is the practice of everyday people that they don't want to get involved in the affairs of business, because if you're living in Syria and you get too close to Assad, you're going to get burned. You get too close to the kind of groups who are advocating for Sunni representation, you're going to get burned. Similarly in Lebanon, similarly in other places, that in general the population is going to be quietistic and work with whoever is in power, even if who's in power is a pretty lousy dude. Um, so Halaj at this point gets very interested in criticizing the government, and he's beginning to cause troubles for the people because he's growing in following. Every time he goes now to Mecca, he has a massive retinue that follows him. He has a number of people that have proclaimed him to be the Mahdi, the kind of the return of almost like Jesus. In fact, he himself has begun to see himself as embodying aspects of Jesus's ministry. So the story of his oppression and suffering makes sense to Halaj. In fact, he also talks about Jesus at certain points as an intercessor for him. And in fact, at a certain point in his life, Halaj starts imagining his own martyrdom, and he sees this almost as inevitable, and he starts talking about it in the same ways that Jesus would talk about his own martyrdom. So it should not be too surprising to us that Halaj is in some ways mapping his own story on top of the story of Jesus. Jesus, of course, is a prophet in Islam, Hazrat Isa. And so, as when you are engaging with Isa or with Jesus, you are also engaging with the same kind of message of Quran. So, Halaj starts doing a lot of that as well, which, of course, raises the ire of the conservatives, right? Um, so at a certain point, Halaj is arrested. They're fed up of him, and he's arrested and imprisoned. The charges against him are mostly upsetting the peace and disrupting things. But in addition, there's one other charge. After one of his last trips to Mecca, Halaj decides in the backyard of his garden that he's going to build a mini Kaaba, the black box. He builds one in his garden, and he starts performing the same rites that you would perform at Mecca in his backyard. This freaks people out, right? This is a little bit unusual. Halaj claims that a Turkic commander of an army did the same thing earlier, that while the army was too far away from where Mecca was, that the soldiers wanted to perform pilgrimage but weren't able to, and so the army commander erected a space for which they could perform the same rites as they would at Al-Kaaba. Halaj has done the same thing in his backyard. He's telling people to come and perform the pilgrimage there. This creates a few crises. Number one, you're going to impact the tourism industry. There's an entire industry of people who will take the faithful to Mecca. If you are now challenging that industry, you're going to piss those guys off. You're going to piss their patrons off. So Halaj has annoyed that population. In addition, He's become very publicly critical of corruption in the government. This is, of course, going to aggravate the members of that corrupt government. And so they are going to start getting very annoyed with him. And now he's aggravated members of the ulama because he's doing stuff like building a Kaaba in his backyard. He's claiming he's the truth. He's too troublesome to allow to continue to live. So he's now interned, and this is interred, and this is the second time he's been thrown into prison. This second phase of imprisonment was going to last about 4 years. During this time, Halaj is going to be writing a great deal, and we're going to discuss one of his writings. And at the end of his imprisonment, he's going to be brutally executed. Now, let me read you a little bit of the account of his execution, and you will see why I started with the death of Halaj, and then also where we're going to return to Halaj right now, and why he resonates with the story of Jesus quite a bit. Okay. So Halaj says his prayers on the last day before they take him out. And then he is brought out to the gallows. And here we go. So this is the version of the account by Fariduddin Attar, who we encountered last week. This is from his Stories of Muslim Saints and Mystics. Again, the translation by Arbery is available for free on archive.org, so do check that out. But this is Halaj in prison, being met by his son and his companions right before he's to be executed. Um, okay. Loaded with 13 heavy chains, Halaj strode proudly out the way, waving his arms like a vagabond. Why do you strut so proudly? They asked him. Halaj replied, Because I'm going to the slaughterhouse. And then he recounted in clear tones, My boon's companion not to be accused of mean iniquity. He made me drink him the best, as does the generous host his guest. And when the round was quite complete, he called for sword and winding sheet. Such is his fate who drinks past reason with Draco in the summer season. Then they brought him to the base of the gallows at Bab al Tak. This is one of the gateways in the city. He kissed the wood and he put his foot upon the ladder. How do you feel? They taunted him. Sorry, this is from page 363. Uh, how do you feel? They taunted him. The ascension of true men is atop the gallows, Halaj responded. He was wearing a loincloth around his middle and a mantle upon his shoulders. Turning towards Mecca, he lifted up his hand and communed with God. What he knows, no man knows, Halaj said, and then he climbed up on the gibbet. What do you say? Asked a group of his followers, concerning us who are your disciples, those who would condemn you and stone you. Halaj said, They would have double reward, and you a single, he said. You merely think of me, they are moved by the strength of their belief in God to maintain the rigor of the law. Shebli came and faced him. Have we not forbidden thee all beings? He cried. And then he said, What is Sufism, Halaj? Halaj replied, The least part of it is that which you see, Halaj replied. The loftier part? The part that you cannot reach, Halaj replied. Then the spectators began to throw stones at Shibli to conform and cast a clod, and Halaj sighed. You did not sigh when struck by these stones. Why do you sigh now? Because those who cast stones know not what they are doing. They have an excuse for him. It comes hard to me, for he knows what he ought not to fling at me. Then they cut off Halaj's hands, and he laughed. Why do you laugh? They cried. It is an easy matter to strike off the hands of a man who is bound, he answered. He is a true man who cuts off the hands of attributes which remove the crown of aspiration from the brow of the throne. They then hacked off his feet, and he smiled. With these feet I made only earthly journeys, he said. Other feet I have, which even now are journeying through both worlds. If you are able, hack off those feet. Then he rubbed his bloody and amputated hands over his face, so both that his arms and his face were stained with blood. Why did you do that? They inquired. Much of the blood has drained out of me, he replied, and I realize that my face has grown pale. You suppose that my pallor is because I'm afraid, and I wanted to rub blood on my face so that I may appear rose cheeked in your eyes. The cosmetic of heroes is their blood. Even if you bloodied your face, why then did you stain your arms, Halaj? I was making ablution. What ablution? One who prays 2 rakahs in love, Halaj replied. The ablution is not perfect unless it is performed in blood. Next, they plucked out his eyes, and a roar went up from the crowd. Some wept, some flung stones, and then they went to cut his tongue. Be patient. Let me speak one word, he entreated. O Allah, he cried, lifting his face to the heavens, do not exclude them for the suffering they are bringing to me for thy sake. Neither deprive them of this felicity. Praise to God, for they have cut off my feet as I trod thy way, and if they strike off my head from my body, they have raised me up to the head of the gallows, contemplating thy majesty. Then they cut off his ears and his nose, and an old woman carrying a pitcher happened along. Seeing Halaj, she cried out, strike hard and true. What business does this petty wool carder have to speak of God? Wool carder is the word Halaj is someone who cards wool. That's what she means. The last word Halaj spoke were these quote, love of the one is isolation of the one. And then he chanted the verse, those that believe not therein seek to hasten it, but those who believe in it go in fear of it, knowing that it is the truth. This is his final utterance. Then they cut out his tongue. It was the time of the evening prayer when they removed his head. And even as they removed his head, Halaj smiled, and then he gave up his spirit. A great cry went up from the people. Halaj had carried to the ball of destiny to the boundary of the field of resignation. From each one of its members came the declaration, Ana al-Haq, I am the truth. Next day they declared the scandal will be greater than when he was alive, so they burned his limbs and threw them into the river. So the story of Halaj, as you see, is an execution taking place in the same kind of way we see the execution in a film like Braveheart, right? Like, so the character is conscious that this is coming. They accept the fate which has been dealt to them, and moreover, in the same way of Jesus, they are forgiving even as they are being dismembered, or even as they are being scoured and crucified. In some of the accounts, Halaj is crucified, his limbs are hacked off, his body is rolled, burned, and thrown into the Tigris. In other accounts, as in this one, in this mystical account, as his limbs are removed, each one of his limbs shouts out this declaration, Ana al-Haq, Ana al-Haq. So you can see in the narrative of the death of Halaj is all of these kind of elements coming together is this seeking of martyrdom, because martyrdom is a form of annihilation and it allows you to enter the space of the divine, a sort of passionate outcry that he is experiencing, the people both following him and rejecting him as he's being cut up, and the message that he is delivering to his sort of followers in that moment. So that gives us a little bit of a sense of Halaj, but let me talk a little bit about his writings as well. So, okay, so we've got this kind of crazy figure who becomes a martyr of love, and in terms of martyrdom in Islamic law, there's 3 categories of martyrs. One is the battlefield martyr. Another is the kind of other martyr, because the Hadith traditions claim, for example, that if a house collapses and someone dies in an earthquake, that they would be a form of martyr. And the third kind of martyr is the martyr for love. So someone who dies in a state of spiritual purity, or sometimes the tradition will even say someone who's virginally in love with someone else and dies in pursuit of that love. This creates 3 categories of martyr. Um, so Halaj's tradition identifies him with the martyr of love, which is why there's a lot of books on Sufism describe them as the martyrs of love. Okay. To speak of another figure, let's talk a bit about the way that Milton's devil works. So in the accounts, in the Christian accounts, in the biblical accounts, Satan is often blended together with the figure of the snake in the Garden of Eden. And so when the snake is the tempter and tempts Adam and Eve to eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, In that moment, the snake has usurped perhaps what was intended for these beings. That instead of remaining in the garden, they are now cast out of the garden and they are forced to live on earth. And so, this relationship between the devil or Satan and human beings is a primordial conflict. And this comes up in Christian devotion and thought a great deal until we get to a character like Milton. And Milton is going to give us a very different side of the devil. In fact, one of the most famous phrases from Milton's Devil in Paradise Lost is, quote, "It is better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven." And he also interprets the devil to be more in line with an Aristotelian tragic figure, more like the way that Aristotle would talk about Oedipus Rex. He is going to similarly want to make the devil in Milton's Paradise Lost a figure like Oedipus Rex, a figure with a deep tragic flaw that ultimately proves his undoing. And in the case of the devil, the deep and tragic flaw is his arrogance or his pride. But at the same time that he's arrogant and prideful, he's also seen as courageous and defying of morals. And if you want to see how this gets interpreted in the modern period, someone like the TV show Lucifer, for example, plays a lot with this idea. So Neil Gaiman, when he's writing the series Sandman, he also is writing about this character Lucifer, who is bored of being in hell. And one of the things about Lucifer in the Neil Gaiman version is that Lucifer doesn't think he did anything wrong. He doesn't think that that by not acknowledging Adam, he thinks that it's not worth being kicked out of heaven for that. Um, and so too in the Islamic account, the version of the devil, and here I have an image here from. Let me give you a sense of where that's from. This is the 14th or 15th century. We don't know exactly who the artist is, but this is preserved at the Topekapi Museum, and this is meant to be an image of so-called Iblis in the Quran, and this corresponds a little bit with the devil or Lucifer in the Christian accounts. But this character here is depicted with a candlelight with candles and some kind of a bucket on his head. It kind of looks to me like a dude, laying in with his Donair sauce bottles. But at any rate, let's discuss who this Iblis is. So the Quranic accounts of Iblis or the devil often go in this fashion that the angels, once God creates human beings and gives life to human beings, all of the angels are told to bow before Adam. And Iblis refuses to do so. And in the accounts of the Quran, generally, the reasons that he gives for refusing to bow to Adam is because he thinks he's better. He says, "I'm formed of some of better material. You've made this guy out of dirt and clay. I'm of a higher form." Or alternatively, why should an angel or a jinn who lives amongst the angels be in the business of bowing to this other lower form of creation? And so, in general, the crime of the devil in the case of Islam is his hubris, is his pride, and his pride is his undoing, and that's why he's condemned. But one important difference in Islam is whereas the devil in Christianity is often is evil itself in the Quran, it's there's a distinction made between shaitan or Satan as the source of evil versus Iblis. Iblis is a bit more of ambivalent figure. It doesn't strictly correspond directly to Satan, shaitan, Iblis. That's not quite how it works. Iblis is seen as being a distinct figure in the Quran, and a distinct destiny as well. So, in his book that Mansur Halaj writes while he's in prison, an example of the ways that he interprets the Quranic story of Iblis is as opposed to imagining Iblis as a betrayer, he conceptualizes Iblis as a lover. I know this sounds a bit strange, but let me give you this a better explanation. When God creates the angels and creates the world and creates everything else, uh, the understanding of halaj is all of the world is created in some way to worship God. So Iblis in his creation worships God and worships God alone. And when he is told to prostrate before Adam, bow in prostration to him, he refuses to do so because he refuses to recognize any master other than God. And so it is his refusal because of his love for God that he's thrown out of heaven, according to Halaj, as opposed to his refusal of the command. And Iblis in Halaj's version of the story, let me see if I have it open here. Uh, in the Tawasin of Mansur Halaj, he has a story in which Moses meets up with Iblis, and the following encounter happens. Musa or Moses meets Iblis on the slope of Sinai and says to him, "O Iblis, what prevented you from prostrating?" Iblis replied, "That which prevented me was my declaration of a unique beloved. And had I prostrated, I would have become like you, because you were called upon once to look at the mountain, and you looked and you looked. As for me, I was called upon 1,000 times to prostrate myself to Adam, and I did not prostrate myself, because I stood by the intention of my declaration to love the One." Musa says, "You abandoned a command." Iblis replied, "It wasn't a command, it was a test." Musa says, "But without sin, your face was deformed, you were cast out." Iblis replies, "O Musa, that is but the ambiguity of appearances. The spiritual state does not rely upon appearance and does not change. Gnosis remains true as it was at the beginning and does not change as the individual changes." This is really radical stuff, right? So, in general, for most, the idea that Satan is, or Iblis is the tempter, is someone who leads people away from the path through drink, through drugs, through money, through materialism. In this case, Halaj is imagining him instead to be an a lover, a worthy lover, that it is that Satan says, or in this case, Iblis says, "I loved God so much that when the other angels told me that I should prostrate and bow to Adam, I could not, because I had already a higher responsibility and a higher duty. And then I was punished, I was cast out, and I was deformed. But his love has not changed." So, on Halaj's interpretation of the story of Iblis, he claims in the same way that he himself is being persecuted, right? He himself will be deformed and maimed and beaten, is he's saying it doesn't matter as long as you are fixated on the one and your love for the one is profound. And so Halaj creates something of a model in his story through Iblis, which then he himself becomes a kind of a player in that passion story as well. And so when he is executed and dies, he proclaims this particular deeper understanding. Yeah, it is a very thank you, Peyton. It is a very interesting interpretation, and it's something it's quite wild in some ways, you know, because I wonder if Halaj is drawing upon Aristotle's Poetics, because might have been available to him at the time. And in Poetics, of course, is where Aristotle is going to talk about the nature of tragedy, and so Halaj is perhaps using the philosophical ideas that are present in his time to look at the Quran with fresh eyes. And at the same time, he is making declarations which are really unnerving because he's challenging the government politically. He's siding with a slave revolt. He is performing actions such as encouraging people to perform their pilgrimage at his home. He's deeply, deeply troublesome figure, right, on many levels. And so his execution seems almost inevitable. And he's executed, I think, at about 64 years of age. So he's pretty old when they take him down. But up until then, he has both been loved and hated, because at the same time that a lot of these people are after him, a lot of very powerful people in government connect to what he's saying very deeply, which it should come as no surprise to us that he spends 4 years locked up at the royal palace, right? Like he's not. I don't know what the conditions of his imprisonment were, but it doesn't sound like it was too bad, because he's getting a lot of visitors and he's getting a lot of interaction, even with nobles at this time. So as a result, Halaj operates for us as highlights this kind of ambivalence in the Islamic tradition towards these figures. On the one hand, they're incorporating aspects of religions and philosophies that don't flow naturally from Islam, but he believes are authenticated by the Islamic interpretation. And so I hope that gives you a sense of Halaj and the story of Halaj. I think he's one of the more fascinating figures, and I do highly advise you check out Massignon, or alternatively Mason's texts on him, and he provides a really compelling figure for us. And now I'm going to do the last sort of shift in terms of students of the course and the kind of things we're working towards. So just a heads up, the first assignment for the students is going to be the book review of the Sufi Comics book. For members of the public as well, the Sufi Comics, 40 Sufi Comics is available for free through Creative Commons licenses. If you do a search in Google on 40 Sufi Comics, you'll be able to find it rather easily. I have also posted a copy of the link for the students in Brightspace, and I believe the guide to how to write a book review is there as well. The difference between what the formal requirements of the book review are and what you're going to be doing is that the book review is kind of how you would review an academic text. And just so a heads up, the book, the 40 Sufi Comics book, is not really an academic text. It's more a philosophical and ethical text. It's meant to be an opportunity for you to start thinking and start engaging with the traditions of Sufism, and so it's an invitation to do that. All right. That is the chunk of the words that needed to leave my mouth today. Um, are there any questions, any concerns, anything that I could speak to further? What can I do on that front? Oh, wait, I see one question here posted in the chat. Are there early reports of miracles that Prophet Muhammad performed via through the will of God? Such as the way Jesus performed in the Gospels. Generally, Devin, my understanding is that the early reports of prophetic miracles, there's a lot of debate over whether or not Muhammad performed miracles in his life. And there are books written on his miracles and refutations of those books. One of the problems we have in the modern period is that there has been a much more intense desire to translate the stuff that upholds the orthodoxy of the present, as opposed to challenging the orthodoxy of the present. So a lot of the texts exist but may not exist in translation, may not be readily accessible. And especially devotional texts about the Prophet Muhammad, about how people celebrated his birthday, or the poems they would say about him, or the songs they would sing. A lot of that is less available here in the West, like especially for Muslims who have come up in the West. That is the one area which I would say that you would lack the most in, is the devotional aspects of how people engage with the Prophet. He as a figure, it's much more thinking about him is kind of thinking in the same way that people behave a little bit towards Jesus here, right? There's a veneration of him, there's a celebration of his birth, there's a celebration of his death, and that kind of stuff happens in Islamic context as well, especially with the Milad al-Nabi. Historically a very, very big deal. The birthday of the Prophet was um, in fact, according to colonial administrators, the biggest celebration of the year, perhaps even greater in scale than the Eid celebrations. So that gives you a sense of how important it was. But because a lot of people, especially after the so-called Protestantization of Islam, there was a rejection of the veneration of the Prophet, seen as veneration almost like of an idolatry. So that it would, venerating the prophet would almost cross the line of shirk, of idolatry, and that it was to be discouraged because people were falling too deeply into it. And so in general nowadays, the tap has been turned a bit, and the veneration of the prophet is less prominent than it was perhaps 40 years ago when I was growing up. But yeah, he I mean that is the biggest difference, I would say, between the West and there, is that even conservatives, or so-called fundamentalists, those who want to cling to the earliest tradition of the first 100 years, there's a sense that uh, the prophet's example, and the prophet being the kind of perfect in every way, uh, you hear a lot more conversation about that from everyday people, from everyday people who may not be learned in the same way, that these are the kind of traditions that were practiced growing up. There's an emotional connection to it, and people perform it as a way of community bonding. Okay, do I see? All right. Any other questions, comments, thoughts, or concerns?
Oh, I just got one quick clarification question, if you will. Can you hear me, by the way, to make
Yes,
sure? Okay, good.
loud
Sorry,
and
I
clear.
my cats chew my headphones, so sometimes I plug it in and it turns out it doesn't work. Anyway, so
My solution for the same problem is just take a little bit of soap and run it along the wire, and the cat won't chew it anymore.
that's a very good idea, by the way. I actually will do this. Um, so if I can summarize, what was his distinction between Iblis and Shaitan? To be more like, if you could just summarize, like in I guess a couple sentences, like what would he say the role of this one is and the role of the other one is, if you
You
will?
know, Devin, I would love to give you a really good answer on that, but I'm afraid I'm confused myself as to what the
Okay.
distinction he made. Like I read his Tawasin, and I went back to the Quran and I read it a couple of times, and my sense is that in the Quran, Iblis and Shaitan are closer than Halaj is implying, but I wanted to research a bit further,
Mhm.
and my sense is that Iblis he's a little bit ambivalent, because he's conceptualized often almost as a misleader, as a trickster almost, whereas Shaitan is more associated with evil, and with bad acts, whereas Iblis doesn't quite cross that line. But again, that distinction may be a bit fine. So I tell you what, I'll go into the Encyclopedia of Islam and a couple of other sources, and I'll give you a better answer on that at the
Oh,
top of
thank
the
you so
next
much.
class,
Thank you so much.
because I didn't get the time to be certain on that answer, and I knew you would ask. I knew it. In fact, I have a note here saying Devin will probably ask you what the difference is. Question mark. So I'm sorry I don't have that for you this class, but I will begin the next class with that question answered.
By the way, I guess just to specify, as as his categories, if you describe, they seem to overlap a bit, but they're distinctive.
Hmm.
Like the one that comes to mind is like Surah Al-Ma'idah, that it says, khamr, maisir, like the gambling and wine is amal shaitan. It was the so it's shaitan is used in a way it's he's misleading people through these things of wine and stuff.
Right.
But then he said Iblis was the one that is misleading. So it seems like they, I guess, I don't know how he describes it. Maybe I guess he's just saying they have the same mission or something, but or they have overlap in their mission. But it's interesting interpretation. It's but yeah, I guess I need a more defined answer as to how he does it, because I guess it's really hard to summarize something like this. You know what I mean, in a short period of time.
Right. The A way to maybe also expand our thinking on it is the Hebrew concept of shaitan. is the adversary, right? And the relationship of the adversary to us is one of daunting us from doing what is right. So it could also be a conceptual thing, as in a being who is there to mislead, but
Mm,
it could also be the adversary that we face in our lives. So, for example, materialism could be my devil, could be my adversary. And so, trying to not be materialistic, trying not to be obsessed with the things I can own and buy and sell would be my struggle against my shaitan, my adversary. And that would be more consistent with the pre-Islamic conceptualization of that term. But as I said, I'll give you a much more robust answer at the start of the next class, because I do think that one was important. But when I wrote that question down last night, I just didn't get the time to get to my last sources. And unfortunately, with having us cut off from the library, it is a little bit more difficult for me to get my
mm,
hands on the
yeah.
sources that I need to. But thankfully, in a digital age, most of this stuff is available online. So I will give us a better response for the next class about how we see the devil, and in particular Halaj's interpretation of the devil here, or Iblis here, as a lover, has a very potent impact, and you're going to see him showing up in poetry and in mystical meditations moving forward. And I think even Ibn Arabi has some commentary on this. Um, and Halaj and his life and his example are condemned by conservatives and literalists such as Ibn Taymiyyah, but then also lauded by others such as Rumi. Although Rumi will disagree with Halaj's approach to Iblis, he doesn't quite like that.
So a quick question, just when you say my devil could be like the, I guess, temptation or something, are you referring to the Qadr or just shayateen in general as to how we'd
Shayateen.
enter shayateen? Okay.
Hmm.
Nice.
Hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for the answer.
My,
Thank you
my
so much.
my pleasure. And like I said, we will start the next class at the top of the hour with a bit more on devilry. It's good. It's good to be clear.
Devil.
Good to be clear. Um, any other questions? And then just also a more general concern is: are you finding this material interesting? Is it compelling? Is this a good way for us to go about it, in which we review the readings and the materials there, and then go a bit more into depth into certain concepts and thoughts? Is this working? We're not overwhelming anybody. No one's pulling hair out, I hope. No, good. At least not over this. So in the next class, just as a heads up, we are moving forward. Let me just stop the recording here.